Hello. In this video, we're going to talk about some of the basic control structures that JavaScript provides so we can actually get our code writing and do more than just working with variables. Where'd my mouse go? All right, there we go. So my assumption as we build through this is that you already have basic programming experience. You understand how control structures work. So we're going to sort of go through kind of just real quickly, what are the sort of the syntax, what does it look like in JavaScript? All right. So for conditionals, which is the most fundamental control structure, JavaScript supports if-else statements exactly like it does in Java or Python or R. Same basic idea. The way we write them in JavaScript is we're going to write if, and then we put a set of parentheses, and in that parentheses, we then put our conditional expression, right? If, for example, the outside temperature is less than 60, right? Anything that produces a Boolean or anything that can get coerced into a Boolean, and everything can get coerced into a Boolean. So really you can put anything you want in here. Only put Booleans. That's the best way to write code. We then put a block, and we write blocks in JavaScript by using brackets. So unlike in Python, where we just do indentation, in JavaScript, we're going to write a set of curly braces to indicate what code needs to happen after that. Best styles, you write the sort of opening bracket after on the same line as the if statement. You then indent your next set of content, and then you put the closing bracket after that. And then again, this works just like a normal if statement, right? If this condition is true, this statement, any statements inside this block will execute, and if not, they won't. We can include else's, right? So normal else, right? That's going to execute if there is no if the if isn't true. Same kind of idea with a block. If we want to use else ifs, we write the word else followed by the word if immediately after that. This is unlike in Python where you use elif, or in R, which has some slightly different structures. But this is the same kind of idea that you'll see in all those different languages. So conditionals work exactly the same as they would in other languages. They're going to do the same thing in JavaScript. We'll write if statements all over the place because we want to do lots of logic, lots of decision making along those ways. All right. More complexly is we can use loops. So JavaScript supports the same style loops as Java. It has for loops. It's got while loops. We very rarely use a while loop. We don't touch those. For loops in JavaScript are going to look the same as they do in Java, which is going to be very different from how they might look for Python. So if I was writing this in Java, right, if I wanted to loop through my people array here, if I were in Java, right, I would write for int I is equal to 0, I is less than people array length, I plus plus, right? It's the exact same syntax you're used to writing. You've probably written that 1,000 times. It's muscle memory at this point, and you can't get through it, which is fine. All right, so that's in Java. In JavaScript, though, we would write the exact same thing, more or less, except that in JavaScript, we don't declare variables, right? We don't say something, we don't declare variable types. So we don't say something is an integer or a double. We would have to declare it by using let. Now, note that we don't want to use const here. This is one of the few places we don't want to use const, because our I plus plus is saying I want to increment. I want to increase that I, which means I need to be able to reassign that value. If it was a constant value, I couldn't increment it. And then, of course, inside of there, I can then access my element, my people array, my element at index I, right? That's going to be the thing that I'm interested in, right? That's the person. And then, of course, I can console.log the person's name, for example. Right? I can just do that looping work. And then that will loop through my list of my people array from our previous demo, where we then loop through all their names and see all their content. This is the most standard array. It works fine. If you're coming from Java, it's going to feel really similar. That's fine. That works great. If you're coming from Python, this might feel a little bit weird, and that's okay. Honestly, we probably won't ever use this. In practice, and no matter what your computer science instructors might have told you, we actually very rarely want to loop through arrays and care about the index. If I'm using a loop to go through an array of values, I'm mostly interested in actually working with the values. I don't really care where they are in the list. I don't care if they're the first element or the fifth element or the ninth element. What I'm really interested in here is working with the person. So I can get the person's name. I don't care about the fact the person was at index 0 or 3. Sometimes I do, sometimes, but not always. So in practice, this works fine, but we actually don't end up using it very often. It's kind of redundant. It creates this extra variable. I have to do some extra incrementing work. It's kind of long and wieldy, and this is a little bit nasty. So we try to not do that. What we're going to more often use instead is for-in loops, which you'll see in these in Java. So Java supports sort of for each kind of loops. So Java supports a for each loop. It's also called the enhanced for loop, depending on who you've learned the language from. Right, in Java, this looks like for string name in a name array, right? Or for example, this might be for like some object person inside something else, where we use our colon instead of the in. In Python, this is going to look somewhat similar, right? In Python, you're used to doing a for each loop when you say for name in name array, right? You just literally write out the in directly. So we're going to use the same kind of structure where, again, I don't care about the index. I'm not interested in what spot they live in. I just care about the things I want to loop through. We can do that same kind of loop in JavaScript. And we use that loop using what's called a for of loop. Not a for in, not a for each. It's a for of loop. So the way that we write it out is just like this, right? We'd say, instead of writing our normal loop here, we would say, I'm going to write for const, the thing, right? I'm basically taking this part, right? The thing that I want to assign the person array index I to, right? The person here, and we're going to put that at the start of our loop. So for the person, for each person, for the person of the people array, of the array that I want to access. And then inside that block, I can then just copy in my console.log that person's name, and that will just get the exact same effect we had up here, right? It's the exact same thing we had previously, but with less code, with less typing, in an easier to read kind of way, right? I can say go through each person of the array, log out that person's name. And again, I'll show you that works. It continues to log out that person's name. Of course, I can ask multiple people. I can say log out that person's name, also log out that person's height. And then I can get their names and their heights at the same time. So that's a for of loop. Again, that's what we say for const, the person of. The of is the key part here. JavaScript does support a syntax called for in, where I could say for something in of another value. The for in is used with objects. It's not used with arrays. It works with objects. Technically, it works with an array. If you try to use for in for an array, it will kind of iterate through the things you want. It's just that it's not actually iterating through the values, it's actually iterating through the named properties of the array, of which happen to be those values. So like, it doesn't quite do what you expect, or at least in the way you expect it. It tends to, and potentially, depending on how you've worked with your arrays or objects, it can potentially cause some bugs along the way. So for arrays, we use for of. For in is lets us iterate through objects, but we're not iterating through the values of an object. It iterates through the keys of an object. So if I want to say, so if I had an object here, let's make myself an object real fast, right? So if I have a const, I will do a letter object here, right? A1, B2. Okay, this is a really boring object. That's fine. Right. So if I want to say for const val, we're just going to put a blank for, well, I'll say key in letter object. If I console log this thing I'm looping through, right, this key, what it's looping through is it's looping through the keys, the A, B, C's, right? This part. It's not looping through the values. So a for in loop loops through the keys. It doesn't loop through the values, which is maybe fine. And then, of course, I can take that key, and if I'm interested in what value is at that key, I could then, of course, say get the key and then go to my letter object and get the value at that key. Similar to how this is looping through indices, not values. This loops through keys, not values. So a for in is more conceptually closer to standard old for loop with an index than is to sort of the for of that we use with arrays. Right. And that way I can say get me the A1, B2, C3. Now, if you're using for in, it's really easy to forget that's looping through keys. I personally am a much bigger fan of explicitly saying I am looping through the keys and being very, very clear in your code and to yourself and to anyone else reading it about what you're doing. So what I prefer to do if I want to loop through the keys is to actually go ahead and get me a set of keys. Now remember, the object.keys function will return an array of keys for an object. So instead of, if I want to loop through my letter object here, instead of trying to use a for key in letter object, I could say get me an array of the keys by calling this object.keys function on my letter object. And now I have an array of keys. I can use a for of to loop through the array of keys, right? And then I can say for each I'm sorry for the autocomplete, for const key in, or sorry, of my key array, right? And that's just my standard for, that's my standard for of loop. And then I can do a console.log, and I can put the exact same content in here, right? I can do the same kind of thing I had before. So again, this produces the exact same kind of output, but it makes it very, very clear that I'm looping through the keys, and it's an array of keys that I'm going through. And in fact, this array of keys will always be the same order, so you can actually now deal with the fact that it's an array, not objects that will. So this tends to be a cleaner way of looping through keys of objects if you need to loop through keys of objects. We don't often need to loop through keys of objects. I mean, if you look at this object, right, this is a pretty standard object we'll work with in JavaScript. I would never loop through its keys because I never want to say deal with first the name, then the height, then the weight, because they're distinct values. They're doing different kinds of things. So very rarely will we want to iterate through objects. It happens occasionally, but pretty rarely. And when we want to iterate through arrays, we're generally not interested in the index. We're interested in just in the values. We're just going to loop through the values using this for each, for of kinds of syntax. And that'll get us through our basic structures for doing for loops. Okay. The last major structure that exists in JavaScript are functions. Now, functions aren't really quite control structures in the same sense, but I'm putting them in here just so because they're structural pieces that are important for us to go through. All right. A function in JavaScript is like a static method in Java. So you're probably used to writing methods in Java. You've probably written static ones before, right? That don't belong to classes or objects of some kind. So you, for example, might write a function static greet that takes in a greeting and a name and it returns some greeting. And then, of course, your main function will then log that out and play how it works. So JavaScript functions are going to look a lot like Java functions. Here, I'm going to make some space. Here. So here's my function in Java. No, of course, it's totally incorrect. Like ignore all the red spacing for a moment. Actually, here, we'll comment it out and then you won't notice it. All right, in JavaScript, there's no public or private. All JavaScript functions are globally scoped. We can't make, they're not public or private. We'll talk about later in a future video about how we can use module definitions in order to encapsulate and make private certain values or functions, but there's no keywords public or private, so we just leave that off entirely. Similar, there's no kinds of thing called static because there's no distinction between static functions or not static functions. They're just functions in JavaScript. We don't need to specify data type to return because JavaScript is dynamically typed. So we don't need to specify a data type. It'll just return a value or not return a value. Similarly, we don't need to put data types in front of our variable, our parameters, because again, there's no data types in JavaScript. The one thing we do then add in JavaScript is we're going to add a keyword function at the beginning of our function definition to indicate that I'm defining a function. I am not calling a function. Right? We're indicating that I'm now defining something new. This is kind of like using let or const, except that we're making it for function. So we're going to use the keyword function, which you'll be familiar with from R. You've seen that before as well. And with that, we have a function in JavaScript. We call functions in JavaScript by using the same keywords as the same structure as normal, right? We call the function by writing out the name of the function. We put parentheses, then we pass some values into that parentheses. This could be howdy, y'all. Fine. And we can console log out, and then that's going to give me some results because again, we're returning a value. Notice our keyword return, same way it works in other languages. We'll log a result. Constant. Ta-da, hello world is a function. So again, it works exactly the same way it does in Java. We just write a whole bunch of less keywords around it, a lot less scaffolding to make us our function, but it all works the same way. Right, no access note modifiers, no return types, no types on parameters, and then of course, comma separated parameters as normal. If you're coming from Python, it's going to actually look really, really similar to Python. Instead of using the keyword def, we use the keyword function. And instead of using a sort of a Python style indented block, we use a C style curly brace block. But otherwise, it's exactly the same. So you can actually write your Python code and convert from Python to JavaScript really, really easily. And that's the basic structure for writing functions. So all the details for how functions work are the same as they work in other languages, more or less. JavaScript has some weirdness around like about how it can work with undefined values, because again, anything that you don't declare is just undefined, and JavaScript doesn't care. There's some details in the course textbook about how that works as well. But that's about the pieces for how to get some basic code up and running. So now you should be able to have, we now have functions, we've got loops, we've got control structures. You should now be able to write some basic generic intro level code in order to practice working with the JavaScript language. In future videos, we'll go over some more complexities around the language, and then we'll eventually be able to then bring it into the browser and have it actually do something to our web page instead of just console logging that content out. Great, thank you.